We're delighted to have on This Week in Virginia two key experts from Newport University, the Wason Center, Rebecca Bromley-Trujillo, who is the research director at the Wason Center and also assistant professor in the Department of Political Science. Rebecca received her PhD from Michigan State University, taught for a while at the University of Kentucky. And Tom Kramer is the executive director of the Wason Center, and Tom is well known. Rebecca, you will be, but Tom is well known around Capitol Square here in Richmond and throughout Virginia, going back to the time when he worked with Senator Ken Stolley, now Sheriff Stolley, when he worked with him.
That's right.
When he served a time as executive director of Virginia 21 before coming to Newport. And Tom, I was saying that you're working on completing an advanced degree at the College of William and Mary. So you're juggling doing your academic work plus all of your other work. But we really appreciate your being on. And let's start by having you tell us, how long has the Wason Center been conducting polls? There are several polling entities located in Virginia, but how long has the Wason Center been doing this?
Sure, David, and thank you for having both Becky and I on today. We're always happy to talk about the Wason Center and our polls. You know, the Wason Center has been around for just over 10 years now, and the idea originally came from Judy Wason in a meeting that she had with Dr. Quentin Kidd, whom everybody knows in Virginia politics. And they were talking about how Virginia at the time lacked credible, unbiased, accurate, and independent research into what Virginians thought about issues, and something that was very important to Judy and Harry and Wason in their career is making sure that the public sort of always has a voice in the debate amongst policymakers. And so what they did is they established the Wason Center, and here we are, I guess about 10 or 11 years now, and we're thriving, I guess you could say.
But now neither of you was involved with Wason Center at that time, but from your looking back, what's some of the differences between what you were doing 8 or 9 or 10 years ago and what you're doing now?
Sure. That's an interesting question, because it's like, I think in large part, polling at the Wason Center has largely been the same. And I'll let Becky comment on sort of the ins and outs of polling. She's more of our polling expert on this call right now. But the Wason Center polls on a variety of issues, and like I said, it's like our focus is making sure that we're fostering that conversation that's vital to democracy between the public and policymakers, and we do that via polling. And the issues that we've taken on over the last 10 years are anything that's been in the public's mind at the time the General Assembly or the governor are making key decisions about Virginia. We were at the forefront of polling on the Medicaid expansion, in the conversations around the Affordable Care Act. We've been at the forefront of polling a lot of transportation issues. I know when that perhaps was, I think the Wason Center was founded around some of the transportation debates of the last decade. And so whether it's been that or even the most recent, I guess some of the controversy surrounding policing in Virginia, we're even polling on that. So it's sort of hard to say how it's changed. I mean, we're focused on, this is more Becky's area, but we're focused on producing polls that are live callers, and our live callers, very different from a lot of polling outfits, are actually our students. A lot of firms that are doing this for profit, and I won't knock them for profit, but a prominent reporter in Virginia once told me that our education mission in a lot of ways is what keeps us honest and credible, because at the end of the day, what we're trying to do with the Wason Center, being that we are a university-focused entity, is we're trying to teach students and inspire students to want to get engaged in public policy and civic leadership and engagement. And so, they're learning about the survey process. They're learning about the questions. They're learning how we analyze the questions, how we ask the questions. And so that goes into the heart of what we do and always has been.
Rebecca?
Yeah, so I am obviously very new here. I started as research director this semester, but I've been very familiar with the process and the Wason Center since I came to CNU about 2.5 years ago. And I think what Tom is saying is exactly right, that we are trying to inform the democratic process, make sure people have a nonpartisan voice, they've got the information they need the public as well as elected officials, so they know what the public feels on various issues, and focusing on the issues of the day. So what is pressing right now in this given context? And that's why, this fall we have focused on issues related to COVID-19 and police reform, because these are really hot button issues that the voters are focused on right now, and giving the members of the state legislature and also the public a sense of where people stand on some of these issues, I think is very important to democracy. And so we are doing really what the Wason Center started out trying to do, providing that voice that for Virginians, a broad spectrum of people on the issues of the day.
And let me stick with that just another moment. There's so much election talk that can be distracting. Tell us about your trying to work to stick to your methodologies in the midst of all the buzz around you.
Yes, absolutely. So obviously politics is a high stakes game, and people get pretty intense and passionate about it, and they come at it from partisan points of view. For us, really the main thing is making sure we're just providing the information. We're asking the questions, letting people share their voice on how they feel about these issues. And we are not offering commentary on what we think is the right thing to do on these issues. It's more of a, okay, this is where people stand, whether it's on candidates or on issues, and presenting that information for people to take with it what they want.
In past times, and I don't think it was pointed to the Wason Center, but to some polling entities around the nation, there was questions that, how do you really know you can trust the people that are giving you the answers? If someone trying to give you an answer to try to skew the polls. So how do you meet that challenge?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people are not trusting of polls, and I completely understand. What I would say is that the main thing is methodology. Polling is a scientific exercise that, when done right, can really give you a sense of a race or an issue at a point in time. And so as long as pollsters are trained and you're conducting random sampling, which is very key, obviously, and you have an adequate sample size for the population you're describing, and you're very transparent in your methodology, also, explaining if your weighting process, which weighting is significantly important to representing the demographics of a population, then I think you can trust them to the degree that all polls have a margin of error. All polls are a snapshot in time. And if we're talking about elections, of course, we can't predict precisely who will come out to vote on election day. So it gives you some information, but it's no guarantee that this is exactly what the result will be. And so I'd say trust in the science and the methodology, and then pollsters should be transparent in what they're doing so people can make that decision for themselves.
When I have friends ask me, and I'm not a pollster, saying, how come pollsters get different results? My typical answer was, well, look at the margin of error, and that may be, you would understand it. Is there a better answer that I should be giving than that?
I mean, I think that's certainly highly relevant. So margin of error is important, and some polls are going to have higher margins of error because they're sampling a smaller size or a smaller sample size for their population. So that's going to be key. It also is, when was the poll in the field? Obviously, the context is going to shift what people say in regard to candidates or issues. And certainly, when we think about these different results that we see, methodology and weighting is going to go into it. Also, whether pollsters are calling only landlines or they're calling landlines and cell phones would be relevant, because we know that more and more people don't have landlines. So if you're not polling cell phones, you might be misrepresenting the population. So I'd say methodology matters, timing matters, and obviously margin of error.
Okay. Well, I appreciate this. Tom, anything else about the process that you'd want to mention before we jump into some of the meat of it and what you've been learning in your recent polls?
Oh, sure. No, I think Becky brings up, something that's a pet peeve of mine, and that's when you see how polls are reported sometimes. It's like one of the things that happened in 2016. I mean, as people in the polling industry, we're not naive to hear the criticism, well, pollsters got it wrong in 2016. Well, one of the big factors that we sort of look at, is just that not as many polls got it wrong as polls are misinterpreted. And one of the pieces of one of the reasons why polls are misinterpreted is exactly as you say, the margins of error were not considered appropriately. And so when we type out our methodologies, and it's always important to look at the methodologies at the back of every single polling report or survey report, we have a line that shows, if we're citing a plus or minus 3.4%, we're looking at, we show, 50, like we basically define the range that people can expect with our poll. And so one of the things that I'll point out and give, kudos to the Washington Post and the Schar School, the very last poll that they released for the Virginia presidential contest, it showed the margin of error bands graphically. And one of the reasons why, or the Washington Post is correctly reporting that poll is because, they're showing the band, and they showed that there's no overlap between the Trump band and the Biden band, which shows that, at least for that poll and that point in time, Biden certainly was polling well ahead of President Trump. So that's sort of like my little piece to add. Now, a few other things happened in 2016 that Becky can get into, but that's certainly one of my pet peeves.
So what else happened in 2016, Becky?
Well, there's a lot of things there. I mean, certainly a lot of the national polling was actually pretty close. Where the real issues were is in state polling. State polling is known to be less reliable in part because there are fewer polls, and you like to have several polls so that you can average them and get rid of some of that random error you're going to see in every poll. So that's part of it. Another part of it is that many state polls underestimated the non-college educated voters that went for Trump in 2016. And a lot of pollsters have changed their process in part to reflect that. And this was particularly bad in states like Pennsylvania and Michigan, where the polling was way off, where they really just underestimated those white non-college educated voters coming out to vote. And so nowadays, most pollsters are waiting for educational attainment, and we are as well, to reflect the fact, or something that we've learned as pollsters since 2016. And as Tom pointed out, some of it is just misinterpreting those polls and the fact that there are margins of error. But it's also that there were some issues with some of the polling at that time.
I would think it would be another challenge for pollsters in any number of the states, particularly so-called swing states, as they maybe weight some trying to make up for the mistakes made in 2016. Now, how are they calculating perhaps even a higher turnout among African Americans, among possibly Latinos and others? So I won't say that I feel for them, but I think that it must be a real challenge to know how much weight do you put in each of those different categories. And so thinking about Virginia, which is your area of expertise on the polling, how do you kind of thread that needle of making sure, feeling fairly confident that you're weighting it properly?
We have data on likely voters, so we know what the electorate looked like over the last few years, and our weighting procedures are trying to reflect that. So if people have been voting in at least 2 of the last 4 elections, general elections, they get into the likely voter model. And so we're trying to make sure we're capturing who we expect to vote. But you're absolutely right that on election day, if a certain demographic turns out at much higher rates than they have in previous years, then that's likely to not be reflected in the polling. We try to get as close as humanly possible, but in the end, it's what are the voters going to do on election day? And of course, this time around, leading up to election day, where maybe around 2 million voters have already cast their votes in the state of Virginia, and many states have seen huge early voter turnout. So this is an unusual time and a very difficult time to be a pollster, I would say. But I think most pollsters are doing their best to capture that, and we'll see what happens.
And the other thing, it's like we sort of like to say about polling that there's polling is part science and part art. And one of the things, it's like when you talk about trying to model, who's going to show up at the polls as a polling entity, we've resisted the urge to poll outside of Virginia because we just don't feel like we know Virginia like any other place, like we know Virginia. And one of the reasons I think that we have a reputation for accuracy is that we do poll Virginia a lot, and we do it really well, and it goes to inform it informs how we model the electorate when we do it.
Okay, so you've done some polling in the fall. You've done some polling here now in October as it's approaching November. What results are you finding in your polling? Let me just throw it wide open, and you pick the subject area in the polling that maybe is most striking to you.
Yeah, so I mean, we have covered a variety of areas. So I'll kind of just outline what we have pulled on, and then I'll focus in on the presidential race since that's upcoming here. But we have pulled on a series of election-related, candidacies. So we've got the presidential race, we have the U.S. Senate race in Virginia and Congressional District 2 between Luria and Taylor. And then we have also pulled on issues, police reform and COVID-19 response. And so with the presidential race, and I should add, we also pulled on the constitutional amendment in the state of Virginia dealing with redistricting. But in the presidential race, I'd say, we started off with Joe Biden leading Trump in mid-September at +5. But our most recent poll that is coming out today, we actually show Joe Biden ahead by 12 points in this poll. So it looks like his lead is expanding with Democrat Joe Biden at 53%, President Trump at 41%. So, this is maybe not surprising in the state of Virginia because the state is shifting more Democratic over time. And if you look back, we were only briefly a swing state. Really, it was solidly Republican. Suddenly, Barack Obama wins the state and it starts shifting blue. And in 2016, they thought maybe it was a swing state. I'd say it's not a swing state right now. Biden is doing very well.
Before you would move to other subjects, you mentioned Mark Rozelle, and I've got a quote here I want to read. You're probably familiar with it. Rozelle said just very recently, the Schar School of Public Policy and Government, George Mason, that if Biden wins Virginia by double digits, I think the election is over. He was saying he thought that would be a harbinger of the national race. And it's intriguing that your polling at this snapshot of this time shows double digits. Would you go as far as your colleague Rozelle is going? You think if on election day or maybe 2 or 3 days after when all the votes are counted, and I will say with the registrars, election officials being able to count those, get those absentee ballots in the process, we should know Virginia's results, I think, on the 3rd before midnight. We won't know about those other ballots yet that can legally come in. Some maybe from overseas and some domestic, but so I'm tossing you the hot potato. Would you go that far? If it's double digits, do you think, not that people will go to sleep saying they know what's going to happen?
Tom, do you want to take this one first?
Sure. I would say just because because we know the Virginia result, I wouldn't go to sleep saying I knew the result of the whole election. I do think that there's an interesting, I think what Mark is talking about, and I think he's right about saying, if you look at Virginia and how we report, that does sort of enable you to see trends that we might see throughout the rest of the country. And so if Virginia ends up being sort of a +10 or a double-digit lead, I mean, I think you start looking up and down the East Coast and some of the other swing states, and maybe Georgia, maybe Florida, where some of the populations in the suburbs, if you see a repeat of our suburbs, which are in Georgia and Florida, it is possible that Mark is absolutely right that if we are +10 or 12, then you could see other states following suit. And I'm more on the camp that if you see Florida go that night, then I'll go to bed and think that I know who won the election.
Right. There are some who are predictors, not necessarily pollsters, who are saying that if Florida goes to Biden, then the route to victory, to re-election for Trump is extremely, extremely difficult. And well, what else have you found here in Virginia? Let's stick with your areas in Virginia. How's it polling for the Senate race and also the second congressional district, and then tell us about the constitutional amendment too.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, in the US Senate race, Democrat Mark Warner, the incumbent, is certainly doing very well in the state. Our initial polling showed him up by 13 points. Our polling coming out today is showing him up by 20 points over Republican Daniel Gade. So, just kind of expanding this really commanding lead that he seems to have in the state. He's really winning over independents at huge margins, and also the traditional Democratic coalition of Black voters, women, college educated voters. And really, Daniel Gade is only showing his strength among partisans, and even then, a little bit under what you might expect Republicans to support him at. So that race is looking pretty solidly. Mark Warner from our poll results. In terms of the
Before you go to the second congressional districts, help me understand, and maybe some of our viewers too. If Biden is ahead by 12, how does Warner get ahead by 20? How do you interpret that?
Well, Warner is the known quantity in the state. He is the incumbent. He has a lot of sway with those independent voters. And so in ways, this is not entirely surprising. And, in the last election he had was much more competitive, but the national factors that were contributing to that were not in his favor. You look the previous one before that, he was sitting quite high up as he is now. And so I think it's logical, but it seems in ways it feels unusual because people are so partisan and we tend to see a lot of the straight ticket voting. But in this case, Warner is just a different beast in the state of Virginia.
I guess with a salute to Mark Warner, who's been around for a long time, served in many capacities. I should say, if Warner is winning by 20, why isn't Biden winning by 20? That was, but I said it the wrong way. Now, okay, now you were about to tell us about the congressional district race.
Yeah, or Tom, did you want to add anything? I don't want to.
No,
okay.
That's right. I mean, I think initially when we did see that, we sort of asked the same question that you did, David. It's like, what is it that causes Biden and Warner to have such a different result in the poll? I mean, because clearly it seems as though some people are showing up in the booth to say, okay, well, I'll vote, Trump Warner. And it sort of does show that, it's his strength among independents that might support President Trump. And it's also his strength among Republicans that he undoubtedly has like a great relationship with, because he's the Warner brand is so strong in Virginia.
And I could see where some would vote Warner and not vote in the presidential. If they were Republicans who were having some challenges voting for the incumbent, that they wouldn't vote for Biden, but they would vote for Warner. So it'd be interesting now to see if Warner comes in with more actually votes than Biden. That will be second congressional district. How's that looking?
Yeah, so this is, incumbent Elaine Luria in a rematch against Scott Taylor, who previously held the seat in the district. And Elaine Luria took that seat in the blue wave a couple of years ago. And so right now our polling is showing Luria up by 7 points. And she's doing well among independents in particular, and also certainly the Democratic base, Black voters, women voters, and college educated voters. And so, it seems that her messaging is coming across. I mean, I live in the district, so I receive mailers from both candidates almost every day. And her messaging has been focused on her own service, but also on an election scandal that was associated with Taylor staffers a couple of years prior. And though Taylor has not been implicated in it, it has been an issue that seems to be following him. And in our poll, we do show that people that believe that that's an important issue to their vote choice strongly support Luria. We also asked about her vote on impeachment of President Trump, because that's something the Taylor campaign has brought up as something against her, that she's too liberal for the district, that she went after the president with her impeachment vote. And so what we actually find in our poll results is that for those that care about her vote for impeachment in their vote choice, they actually support her. And so that messaging hasn't quite landed for the Taylor campaign. And it looks like Luria just has some higher favorability ratings as well among the voters, whereas Taylor is a little bit underwater in his favorability, his net favorability. So it's looking like Luria will take this, but certainly has been a competitive race, and originally was seen as a toss-up by many pollsters, and now they did actually, the Cook report actually shifted it to a lean Democrat after our poll results came out. So we'll see what happens.
Okay, what about the congressional amendments? There's only one of them. I guess it's controversial.
True. Yeah. Tom, did you want to speak to this first? Or?
Sure. And so this is an interesting, the results here are very interesting. What our poll reports today is that, as of today, 54% of people are in favor of the amendment and 24% of people are opposed. And I think one of the interesting things that we cite in the poll is that, Democrats are still largely in support of the amendment, while Republicans are still against the amendment. And that's sort of odd, because the leadership of both parties, is sort of working differently than the grassroots or their voters. And so that's just sort of evidence that, it sort of takes time before the leadership of a party just makes a decision on the issue for it to sort of diffuse down to all the voters. And this is an interesting issue in general, but this is one of those that the Wason Center has been polling for a long time, just redistricting overall. And I'm not sort of surprised by that issue between Republicans and Democrats, because this is such a process heavy issue. When we first started polling this almost a decade ago, not many people had heard of redistricting. They weren't, we had people that rated don't know when we would ask them questions about redistricting. And now people are sort of very familiar with what redistricting is, somewhat how it works. But still, the process heavy component of this, the fact that the Democratic Party itself is against Amendment 1, and the fact that their voters are still for Amendment 1 just sort of speaks to the complicated nature of the process. But in general, I think our poll finds that this is poised to pass.
Well, any other tidbits of exciting information you want to share with us before we have to end for the day?
On the polling front, I think another thing to go back and say, if in fact former Vice President Biden does win Virginia with double digits, that does bode well for Democrats running in those congressional districts. So that would sort of confirm Congresswoman Lauria's, +7 over Scott Taylor. That does bode well for Congresswoman Spanberger. And, what seems to be a coin toss in the 5th district, that does sort of give an edge to Dr. Cameron Webb. So I think that +12, if that holds on election day, that could be a good indicator for those other candidates. So in terms of news, what we are also announcing today on behalf of the Wason Center is a whole new slate of programming that's meant to inform and inspire the next generation of young people to seek civic leadership opportunities. 10 years ago, the Wason Center was started because, between Judy Wason and Quentin Kidd, they were trying to solve a real problem in Virginia, and that was, the lack of unbiased and independent information that elected officials and citizens could use to make decisions. Well, Judy and Harry came to us at what was the 10-year mark and said to us, one of the pieces of the Wason Center that's so important to them is the education component of our mission. And they asked us, how could we grow the education component of our mission to tackle, what many would recognize across the Commonwealth and certainly the nation is the need for, solid, humble, data-driven leaders. And so what we're announcing today, and we'd invite anybody that watches this and your guests to go to our website, cnu.edu, just the Christopher Newport website. And we're showcasing a whole new set of programs meant to inspire our students at Christopher Newport to become the civic leaders of tomorrow.
Okay, that is exciting. And we're going to put that website up 2 or 3 times and people will see it. And I want to very much thank each of you for the work that you're doing, for your report that you've given, and for being on This Week in Virginia. And we look forward to having future conversations with you as well. So thanks very much.